When we compare the balance of power between the United States and China, our attention almost always goes to the visible symbols of strength: aircraft carriers slicing through oceans, sprawling military bases, trillion-dollar defense budgets. But this focus on hardware distracts us from the single most powerful instrument in America's arsenal. And it isn't a missile, a tank, or a fighter jet, it's the US dollar. For generations, the dollar has functioned as a global public utility, the currency the entire world relies on to trade, to settle debts, and to measure value. It is in many ways the oxygen of the world economy. Because of this unique role, the United States enjoys what former French President Valéry Giscard disdainfully described as an exorbitant privilege. The dollar allows America to fund deficits and sustain spending levels that would collapse any other nation. It lets the US live beyond its means, and have the rest of the world accept it. But hidden inside this privilege is a paradox. While Washington views China as its primary strategic rival, America's financial architecture, the very system that sustains its global power, is deeply structurally tied to China. And in recent years, the US has increasingly begun using that financial dominance as a weapon. Before we go deeper, if you're finding this breakdown eye-opening, drop a comment with Part 2, so others know you're following the full story, and make sure you subscribe. This channel dives into global power the way the news never does. Now, to understand the stakes, we must unpack how the dollar really works. The United States operates with what economists call twin deficits. Domestically, Washington spends more than it collects. A fiscal deficit. Internationally, America buys far more than it sells. A trade deficit. In any normal country, this would be catastrophic. When nations like Greece or Argentina overspend, they face collapse, austerity, and years of suffering. But America is treated differently. Instead of facing a crisis, the US simply issues treasury bills, pieces of paper backed by trust, and the world eagerly buys them. The cost to print them is pennies. The value extracted from them is trillions. China plays a massive, irreplaceable role in this cycle. Chinese workers earn the dollars that flow back toward American debt. Beijing converts those dollars into US treasuries, becoming one of America's biggest creditors with over $1 trillion in holdings. This creates a stunning reality: the American lifestyle is effectively subsidized by the Chinese worker. The US buys Chinese products using money it prints. China sends back real value, labor, production, savings, in exchange for paper assets backed by faith in the system. And that word, faith, is the linchpin. The global economy functions because countries believe the dollar is neutral, stable, and globally responsible. They believe the United States will not abuse its financial dominance for narrow political gain. But that belief is fading. In the past decade, the US shifted from multilateral, internationally agreed sanctions to something far more dangerous: unilateral financial punishment. It discovered that because the dollar touches almost every global transaction, American laws can reach far beyond American borders. This is the weaponization of the dollar. Consider Standard Chartered, a British bank. In 2012, it was fined $340 million for trading with Iran. Not because it violated British law, not because it violated UN law, but because the transactions happened in dollars. The US could punish a foreign company for breaking American domestic rules, simply because the currency involved was American. 3 years later, France's BNP Paribas was hit with an almost unbelievable $9 billion fine for similar reasons. Each penalty sent a chilling message: the dollar is no longer just a public good, it is a geopolitical weapon. And whoever holds it risks losing a finger. This trend escalated under the Trump administration when Washington unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, an agreement approved by the UN Security Council and signed by nearly every major world power. By leaving it, the US violated international consensus. But what alarmed the world even more was what Washington did next. It threatened sanctions on any country that continued trading with Iran. Suddenly, America's closest allies, France, Germany, the UK, found themselves legally allowed to trade under international law but financially threatened under US law. This contradiction forced them to create an alternative system: Einstix, a dollar-free payment channel designed to bypass American authority. It barely moved money, but it moved history. For the first time, America's allies built a system specifically designed to escape the dollar's reach. If you're still with me, let me know in the comments. Should nations have the right to trade without US oversight? Because what happened next signaled something even bigger. Countries realized that if the dollar can be used as a weapon, then depending on it is a vulnerability. The world is now quietly looking for escape routes. China cannot yet replace the dollar. Its own currency is not fully convertible, and its markets lack depth. But China can undermine the dollar's dominance in trade settlements, which is where the real leverage lies. In 2019, Xi Jinping announced China would prioritize blockchain technology. Behind the scenes, Beijing was preparing a digital currency, one that could allow countries to trade with China without ever touching a US bank. A digital system like this would let nations buy oil, gas, minerals, or food from one another without a single American dollar involved. And if that happens, even slowly, the dollar's hold begins to slip. Historian Niall Ferguson warned that China is building a global financial nervous system through platforms like Alipay and WeChat Pay. If these systems link up internationally, he said, the US could face its financial D-Day, the day the dollar loses its crown. This is the Jenga scenario: remove enough blocks and the entire tower collapses. The dollar is that critical block, and right now, the United States is chipping away at it with its own hands. If the dollar's dominance is the foundation beneath America's global power, then weakening that foundation, even unintentionally, carries enormous consequences. And yet, Washington continues, taking risks with the very asset that props up its influence. Why? The answer lies in a deeper strategic disconnect. Henry Kissinger once explained that American strategy often resembles Western chess, focused on immediate wins, decisive blows, and fast victories. China, by contrast, plays Go, a game of patience, positioning, and quiet accumulation. America moves for the moment. China moves for the century. So when China quietly builds long-term economic assets, the US responds with short-term political gestures like tariffs, sanctions, and public pressure campaigns. When China launched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a financial institution to expand its global influence, Washington urged allies not to join. But allies did join, including Britain, Germany, and India. When China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, the US opposed it. Yet by 2019, 125 nations had signed on. Meanwhile, America pulled out of the Pacific Partnership, a trade agreement that would have anchored US leadership in Asia for decades. In trying to counter China, the United States accidentally cleared the field for Chinese influence to grow. China, for its part, has been studying America very carefully. Chinese leaders admire how the US attracts global talent, how its innovation ecosystem thrives, how its institutions endure turbulence. Because they understand America's strengths, they avoid repeating its mistakes. They avoid military adventures. They avoid spending spirals. They avoid the trap that crushed the Soviet Union, pouring too much money into weapons and too little into people. China hasn't fired a shot across its border in more than 30 years. Instead, while America invested trillions into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, China poured trillions into infrastructure, manufacturing, and global partnerships. The battlefield isn't the battlefield anymore, it's the balance sheet. And if you're following this slow shift in world power, let me know in the comments, do you believe economic warfare has replaced military warfare? Now, let's return to the central question: can the United States actually lose? For many Americans, that sounds impossible. America feels like the center of history. Technologically superior, militarily dominant, fundamentally exceptional. But history isn't static. For centuries, China and India were the world's largest economies. Western dominance is the anomaly, not the rule. The US still has extraordinary strengths: the world's best universities, unrivaled tech innovation, strong institutions, and a vibrant society. But the erosion of trust in the dollar represents a flashing red warning light on the dashboard of American power. Because the American standard of living depends on the world's willingness to hold American debt. If countries lose faith in the dollar, even slowly, the consequences will be severe. America would no longer be able to print money to buy Chinese goods. Americans would no longer live beyond what the country produces. Interest rates would rise. Inflation would surge. Standards of living would fall. The geopolitical earthquake would be felt not in elite Washington circles, but in everyday American households. And here is the deepest irony: the greatest threat to America may not be a rising China but a miscalculating America. If Washington continues reacting emotionally instead of strategically, if it weaponizes the very system that sustains its power, if it alienates allies instead of building coalitions, if it erodes trust in the dollar while China builds alternatives, then the US may trigger the decline it fears with its own decisions. At the dawn of the Cold War, George Kennan warned that America's survival would depend not on defeating rivals, but on maintaining its own internal strength and coherence. That warning echoes louder today than ever. Because the real contest isn't about who wins the next confrontation, it's about who builds the next foundation. If this breakdown gave you clarity, let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep geopolitical analysis explained simply, make sure you subscribe. It helps the channel grow and ensures you never miss the next chapter of this story.